Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to be learning all about React. Here is the list of topics that we will be covering in this video. We're going to be moving really quickly in this video, so feel free to pause the video if you feel like I'm going too fast. Alright, let's get started. Alright, first, let's talk about the key features of React that make it worth using. First, it's declarative, which basically means that it's state-based. This means that you declare what state a component is in, and then it'll figure out how to render based upon that state. So React components are really predictable. You know exactly how it's going to be rendering based upon what you put into it. Next, it's component-based, which makes it really scalable. This means that you can create self-contained components that can basically be dropped into other components, and these components maintain their own state, so they're self-contained. So this helps you prevent your code from getting really unwieldy and enormous by creating these smaller, composable components. And third, React is really unopinionated, which basically means that it's just the view layer, which means that you can incrementally put it into your project without needing to revamp the whole thing. And because it's just the view layer, it's really small and isolated, which makes it fast and performant. Another reason why React is so fast is that it uses something called the virtual DOM. What the virtual DOM does is it takes the difference between two states of our application and makes only the minimum amount of change necessary to render those changes. Also, the virtual DOM allows us to not directly manipulate the DOM, which is really expensive, but rather our changes are made to the virtual DOM instead. Next, let's learn how to get started with and install React. Probably the best way to do this is to use Create React App, which is developed by Facebook itself. It has an enormous amount of stars, which means that it's extremely popular and tested. To use Create React App, let's just follow these instructions here. First, we need to do npx create react app my app, or we can name it whatever we want. To use npx, we need npm 5.2 and higher, so we can go to Node.js and download the latest version of Node, which will give us that npx. So let's just follow these instructions here, and let's create a different folder name. So I'm going to do npx create react app, and I'm going to name it React Tutorial. Press enter. It's going to install it and also install the dependencies, so it's going to take a little while. Let's just wait for that to finish. Now let's follow these instructions at the bottom of the screen right here. So we're going to do cd react tutorial, and then we're going to do yarn start, and that's going to automatically open up the React app in a browser window just like this. And so you see here we just have a boilerplate template right here, and we're ready to get started. Okay, now I've opened up the Create React App folder inside of my text editor. I'm going to be using Sublime Text, but you can use whatever text editor you want. Let's just take a look inside this folder to see what we have here. First, let's take a look at the index.js file. You'll see that here, this is where the app is actually rendered. You're rendering the component app onto the element root, which you can find at the index.html file, which is right here. So the app is basically being rendered inside of this root ID here. And now let's take a look at this app component right here, which is going to be this file right here. You'll see that this file is not highlighted very well, so I would highly recommend installing a JSX syntax highlighter. Different text editors will do this in different way. So here I would go to install package. Since I already have it, let me just show you where it is. Package. So the syntax highlighter that I'm using is just called JSX. So I would find something similar for your text editor and then install it. And once you have it installed, you can select the JSX syntax highlighting. I'm going to select that here. And now you can see that it's highlighted much cleaner, which is going to help us as we develop using JSX. Next, React is usually coded using ES6 syntax. So you'll see that this is not normal JavaScript. We have import React here, import logo. So import is an ES6 feature. Also this class app extends component, that's also an EX6 thing. So ES6 allows us to create classes using JavaScript, just like we can do in other languages. There's other unique things you can do with the ES6 syntax, which we'll go into a little bit later. For now, just know that React uses ES6 to help make developing React components more efficient and clean. Next, let's talk about the component or the class structure of React. You'll notice that here we have class app extends component. This component comes from React, which is basically the heart of React components. You'll see that inside of this component we have a render method which returns the element or the HTML that we're going to render in our app. So you'll see that here we have the image up here, the welcome to React, and the to get started, etc. To add on to a React component, we just basically add new methods, so we can create methods such as onClicks, etc. So to build out a component, we basically add new methods to it. And we'll go through all of the different methods that you can add onto React components. Next, React uses something called JSX syntax. Notice that we have HTML elements right inside of our JavaScript. This is kind of unusual. This JSX syntax needs to be compiled using something external. The way that I believe Create React App does this is it uses a Babel compiler inside of a Webpack, but it's all hidden away inside of this React scripts here, so we can't see it right now. We could see it if we ejected it, which would then bring all the setup stuff inside of this folder here. We could replace all of this HTML here with pure JavaScript, but nobody writes React that way because the HTML is a lot cleaner, it's a lot easier to see what your component looks like, and it's a lot more natural to write HTML than it is to write HTML using JavaScript. There's going to be a few slightly different things using JSX syntax than just pure HTML. You'll notice that here we use class name instead of just class. If you use class, it won't work properly, so make sure you use class name here. Other things that might be a little bit different are you'll need to use HTML4 instead of just 4. But those things, if you make a mistake, there will be warnings in the console telling you what you need to use. Next, let's take a look at this render function. This is the foundation of React components because it actually renders what shows up on the page. So let's play around with it by replacing this inside with a h1 my app, and we're going to save it, and it's going to auto refresh just like that. And you can also place variables inside of the render HTML. You can say, let's say const title equals this is Michael's app, and then let's put title in here. The way that we put a variable inside of our JSX is we put single curly braces around the variable. So let's say title, we save, and now it says this is Michael's app. You can also put logic in here. For example, if we had const another title equals another title, and then we can have a ternary here, say, let's say we want to do something like, this is very contrived, this isn't actually real world, but I just want to show you that you can put logic in here. We can say if true, oops, I should go back one. If true, we want to do another title, else we want to do title. We can put logic in there like that. Now it shows another title because this is true right here. Generally speaking, though, we want to try to keep as much logic out of the JSX as possible and put them into helper methods above the render function. Now let's take a look at how to render lists. Let's say we have a const list. Let's just have an array of some strings. Let's say item 1, item 2, another item. To render this list, we can use a map method. So we can say list.map and then item, and then let's just basically return item here. Let's save it. Now you can see that we have item 1, item 2, and another item rendered here. To make it look a little bit nicer, we can say we can create divs around them like this to make them on new lines. So div, and then use a single curly brace to put in the variable, div like that. Save it. Now you'll see that they're on new lines. Now let's learn how to set up event handlers in React. To do that, we can just add event handler attributes here. So for example, we have onClick here, and we can have a bunch of different ones. There's onClick. We can also have onMouse enter. There's also onMouse leave. We can do onKey down. Pretty much every event handler there is, you can put that into React. We can also do onSubmit for forms, not for divs. We can do onChange for inputs. We can do onFocus for inputs, and so on. There's a huge list of things that we can do. So let's just try doing an onClick handler here. And so let's say when we click on an item, we're going to call the method this.onClick. And then let's define that method up here. Let's say onClick. And when we click on it, let's just say alert clicked. Save it. Let's click on one of these, and you'll see that the alert clicked shows up. And just for fun, let's just try another one. Let's try on mouse over, on mouse enter, or on mouse over. I think both of them work. Let's just replace both of these, on mouse enter, and then we're going to say mouse entered. Save it. Let's mouse enter it, and you'll see that the alert shows up correctly. Let's try a few event handlers with inputs. So let's create an input down here, and let's just say onChange. This.onChange. Let's put onChange up here, and then an event here. And then when it changes, let's console log out event.target.value, which is going to be the value of the input. Let's log that out to our console. I press Command Alt J here. Oh, and you'll see that each child in an array or iterator should have a unique key prop. So basically, whenever you render an array, you want to add a key prop like this. So we'll say key is going to be item here. It should be unique. So once we do that, that'll go away. So now let's change this input. We'll say hello. And you'll see that as I change it, it'll be logging out whatever I type here. Just one more thing. Let's just try the onSubmit with the form. So let's just say onSubmit, this dot onSubmit, and then we close it. Form, move this up, change this to onSubmit, and then we have an event there. And usually when we use onSubmit, we want to event.prevent default to prevent the page from refreshing. So say event.prevent default, and then we'll just say alert submitted. And we can submit it just by pressing enter. So let's try that. Here, enter, and you'll see that the submitted shows up. Next, let's talk about refs. If we add a ref attribute to an element, it's going to basically be a reference to that element. So we can do something like ref. And we used to be able to put strings here, or it might actually still work, so we could say input. But now the recommended way to do it is to make it a function. So a ref, it's going to give you an input as a parameter. And this is ES6 syntax, so basically input is the parameter. And we can say this dot input is equal to input. So basically now this is setting this dot input equal to basically this input tag or element right here. So now let's just say when we submit it, let's just basically console log out this dot input. So since this is a reference to this input right here, we can say this dot input dot value. So that'll actually give us the value of the input. Let's try that out. So now let's type in hello and then enter to submit. And the reason why this error showed up is because this onSubmit needs to be bound to this component. And when you pass it in as a prop like this, it won't be bound correctly unless you bind it in the constructor. So with this class syntax with ES6, you get a constructor method where we can bind these methods to this component. So let's just create a constructor method here. And then usually we put in props here. And with constructors, you need to put in super props. It's just the syntax for that. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but that's not very important. So here we're going to say this dot onSubmit is equal to this dot onSubmit dot bind this. I know this seems kind of tedious, but this is the general way to do it. There's another way to do it that might be a little bit shorter, but this is a really acceptable method, so that's fine. So let's save it. So now onSubmit, this will be actually defined, whereas it wasn't before. So let's put in hello, my name is Michael, enter, and you'll see now that it's logged correctly. Before, this was referring to the window, so this dot input was not defined, but now that onSubmit is bound to this dot input is indeed defined. So basically, whenever you pass in a method of the component to a element or to a component, you need to bind it to this component for it to work. Next, let's talk about state. We can manage the state of a component by creating a property called this.state, and it's going to be an object. So let's say we have a property in this.state called title, and let's say this is called app title, and let's erase what's in here, and let's just set this title thing inside of an h1 by doing this.state.title, which is what we defined up here. So that should say app title here. So once we save it, it says app title. Next, let's talk about set state. This .set state is used to change the state of your component. So first, let's just get rid of this dead code right here, and also this logo, which is producing these warnings down here. So let's create a div with an onClick handler down here. You can only use onClick on certain elements. You can't do it on h1s apparently. Let's say this is going to be onClick. Let's just say click here. And then let's say that this onClick handler, and well, let's just change all of these to onClick. So here we are binding the onClick to this because we're going to be using this.setState there. Otherwise, the this.setState won't be defined. So basically, we're going to say that onClick, when we click that div, we're going to do this.setState. So we're going to change this title here by doing title. Let's say new app title. So now when we click on it, it should change this title to new app title. So let's try it out. Click here, and you'll see that it worked correctly. Once setState is called, it's going to see everything that's changed in the state of this component, and it's going to flow down to this render function. So anything that's different is going to be reflected in the new HTML here, which is going to be reflected in the browser. Next, let's talk about how to create and import components. Components are isolated, so they can be dropped into any other component easily. So first, let's create a new file here called myComponent.js. And in this component, let's just copy over what we have here. We're going to keep this as simple and basic as possible. Let's get rid of this CSS here, get rid of these methods here. And the render, let's just say the class name is component, and then the class will name this component here also. And let's just return a simple h1. This is a component that is dropped into another component. So now, right here, oh, actually, let's name this my component. Oops, just this and this, my component. And then here, let's import in that component. So let's say import my component from /my component. Now down here, let's drop this component in here by doing my component, and we'll just close it like that. Now we save it. We'll see that the contents of that component were dropped into our app component, just like that. Components allow our app to be more scalable because it allows us to not allow this HTML here to grow into an enormous chunk of code that becomes really unmanageable. Instead, we can see that this my component has a name, and it's really easy to reason about it. And we can go into this file itself to edit just what my component deals with. Next, let's talk about passing and using props. We can pass props into our components by doing something like this. Let's make this multi-line. Let's pass in two different props. Let's say title is equal to, this is the component title. And let's just say name equals, let's just say Michael. And now in this component, we can access the props by doing something like title. And we can say this dot props dot title. And then down here we can do name, this dot props dot name. And then let's close this and then save it. Now you can see that this is the component title was passed in, and Michael was passed in, and we've accessed it by using this dot props here. And to make it a little bit cleaner, we can destructure this. This is using ES6 syntax that we mentioned earlier. We can say const title name equals this dot props. That way we don't need to access this multiple times, and we don't need to write that out multiple times. We can save it like that, and it'll show the same thing. We can also pass methods in here. So if we wanted to pass in this dot onClick, we can say onClick equals this dot onClick. And then in here, we can say div click me. And then we'll say onClick here. And then onClick equals onClick. Now when we click on this, it should set our state to new app title. So let's try that. And it does indeed do what the onClick says it should do. Next, let's talk about prop types. Prop types are used to enforce the type of the props of a component. It can also be used to give an overview of the interface of a component. Basically, what props it accepts and what kind of props it accepts. Prop types used to be included in React, but now it's a separate package because a lot of people don't use them. But they are extremely useful, so I'd recommend that you use them. So to use prop types, let's install them. So npm i-s will install prop types just like that. And let's go into my component and define some prop types. So I'm going to say import prop types from prop types. So I'm going to say const prop types equals, and you'll see down here that we have 3 props here. So the way that we define these prop types, we can say name is prop types dot string. Let's say all of these is required. Well, let's change it up. Let's say not all of them are required. So let's say onClick is prop types dot func. Let's say that's not required. Let's say title prop types dot string, and it is required. And then down here we need to add prop types to our component. So we'll say my component dot prop types equals prop types. We'll save it, Now we'll see that nothing here has changed because all of these are fulfilled. Now let's go back to our app.js file. Now let's change one of these so it's not passing what the myComponent file is expecting. So let's change this to a number, save it. And you'll see here that there's a failed prop type, so it lets us know that we passed in the wrong type. Now let's maybe get rid of this name here, which is required. We'll save it, and we'll see that the prop name is marked as required, but its value is undefined. So prop types are a great way to help us to know when the requirements of a component is not being fulfilled correctly by the props that we're passing in. With prop types, there's a lot of different options that we can use. If we had an object, we can say prop types.shape, and then we can define the shape of what we're passing in, or we can say prop types.array of, and then we can define what the array should look like. We can also do prop types.any to say that any kind of prop is acceptable. Next, default props. We can also set default props for a component by defining a constant here called default props. And let's say we want to set the default name to default name of app. And then let's add it down here, myComponent.default props equals default props. And then let's save it. So now, even though we're not passing in a name from our app.js file here, remember we deleted that, we set the default name prop to be default name of app, and it's showing up here now. So default props are just a great way to define the default settings of a particular component. Next, we can also update our props. So let's get rid of this top part here and just have our component here. And let's say that our name, let's change it to initial name. And let's change this title back to something that is correct. Let's just say initial title. And let's actually make these our initial state. So we'll say title is initial title. And then name is initial name. And let's actually make these props the state. So we'll say this is going to be this.state.name. And down here, it's going to be this.state.title. And now what we're going to do is on click, we're going to set the state to new app title. And then the name is going to be new app name. This is very similar to what we did with this.setState earlier, except now we're basically updating the props of another component. So when we click on the click me here, remember we have this onClick handler here, it's going to change the props of myComponent. So let's try that out. I click on click me, and these now change to new app title and new app name. So when the props of a component changes, the component will automatically figure out the minimum amount of change that it needs to do to update the display of the component. Next, let's talk about React lifecycle methods. If we click on this link right here, we'll see that the component has various lifecycle methods. So mounting methods would include component will mount, which will be run before component mounts, component did mount, which will be run after component mounts, component will receive props, which will be run before a component will receive props, which is pretty obvious. Should component update, basically should the component update based upon the new props and the new state that it's receiving. Component will update, which is run right before a component updates, and component did update, which is run right after a component updates. So let's make this smaller again, and let's test out some of these. So let's say up here, let's create a component did mount, or component will mount. Actually, let's just write in both of them, component will mount, and this doesn't take any arguments, and a component will mount, and a component did mount right here. Let's just log out what happens in them. We should expect that the will mount will log out before the did mount. So let's say will mount, and then did mount. Let's refresh. So the will mount showed up before the did mount. Component will mount's a good place to make some AJAX requests so that you can get the data before the component mounts. Component did mount is a good way to maybe focus a field after the component loads. Now let's try some other ones. Let's try component will update. And component will update and component did update, they have two parameters. Component will update will take in next props and next state. So let's console log out those. Let's console log out this.props, this.state, next props, and next state. And then we'll click our button to see the difference. So when I do click me, we can see that the previous props were initial name and initial name, and the previous state was null. The next state was the new app name and the new app title, which we can see in here now. If we did component did update, this will change to prev props and prev state. So let's change these. Prev. Let's just try the same thing. It should be flipped around now. So we can see that the props are now new app name and new app title, and the previous props were initial name and initial name. The other lifecycle methods are basically what the title says, so you can play around with those also. Should component update will return a Boolean. Let's just try that out really quickly. So should component update. And this will also take in next props and next state, but we're not actually going to use them. Let's just return false. So basically whatever happens, our component is not going to update. So now if we click on this click me here, it will not actually update. But if we return true, then we click on the click me, it will allow it to update. Next, let's talk about controlled and uncontrolled inputs. Uncontrolled inputs are basically just like regular inputs. You give them a initial, you can give them a default value or no value at all, and they will basically behave just like a regular input. So this is basically a regular input right here. You can also give uncontrolled inputs a default value. So let's say name, and basically it'll start off as name, and it won't be controlled at all. You can edit it, and it's basically free, whatever you type in here. On the other hand, controlled inputs are inputs where you control every aspect of the value and what happens with it. So let's say we give this a value of name. You're going to get a warning down here because when you give a value prop, you also need an onChange handler so that you can actually control what this value is. You'll see here that if I try to type something in here, it won't change because I've hard-coded the value to be name. So I'm typing in this box and nothing is changing because this value is hard-coded to be name. So the way that we can control an input is, let's set this name to, let's keep it as initial name. And let's just get rid of this title here. And then let's set this value to this.state.name. And then let's multi-line this just to make it a little bit cleaner. And then let's add in an onChange handler, which is what it's asking for. And we'll say this dot, let's just give it a different method name just to show that we don't have to name it exactly what the method, we don't have to name it exactly what this is. Let's say this dot update name. And we'll need to bind it up here since we're going to be using this dot set state in here. So update name, we'll change this to update name. And then basically when we type, we're going to get the event here, and we're going to set state, and we're going to set the new name to the new value in the input. So we'll say the new name is going to be event.target.value, which is going to be the value of the input. So now when we type, every time we type, it's going to be updating the state, it's going to be changing this name, and this name is going to be fed back into this input down here. Controlled inputs are useful for forms where you need to keep track of every input in the form. You can also control text boxes. So let's say we have a type equals checkbox. So here, let's say checked is equal to true. And we'll change this to checked, this.state.checked. Save it. So we'll see that that starts off as checked. And when we click it, nothing happens because this is controlled as checked. If we made it default checked, we would indeed be able to change it because it is no longer controlled. So here you can see that I can actually uncheck it. But let's move this back to checked and make it controlled. And then now on change, let's say this dot update check, We'll say get rid of this event here. We could make this event.target.checked, but let's just say checked will be the opposite of what it previously was. So the opposite of this .state.checked. Let's try it out now. Now you can see that we're able to indeed check and uncheck this checkbox. You should use controlled inputs when you want finer grained control of the inputs that you're using. Next, let's talk about some strategies for rendering that might make your code a little bit cleaner. So let's say here we just have a regular title, an h1 title. We want to decide whether we want to render this title or not. So let's say we have a state here, should render title. And let's say it's false. So some strategies that we can use are we can say, we can have a render title method up here. We can say if this.state that should, so basically if we should not render the title, we return null. And this is a common pattern that we use to show that we don't want to render anything. Otherwise, if we should render the title, we'll return the h1 here. And then here, we can put it in our single curly braces to put in JavaScript logic, render title, and we'll save it. Oh, and we need to delete this method since we got rid of it. So let's save it. Basically now it won't render the title, but if we change this to true, it will render the title. Another way to do the same thing is we can put a ternary in here, so we can say this.state.should render title. Basically, if it should render the title, we will return this h1. Otherwise, we will return null. So here again, it's blank. If we put true up here, it will render the title. And these are just some tricks for rendering to make your code cleaner. You can choose which one you like better. If we put too much of this down here, it might make it ugly down here. So sometimes it's good to move this logic up into a new method up here like this. Next, let's talk a little bit about routing with React. So for our Create React app, if we search for router here, they'll give you instructions for adding a router. So let's click on that. And it says here adding a router. We can do npm install --save react router dom. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's just install that here. npm i-save. This is just shorthand for that. React router dom. And then there's a basic example here. So let's click on that. And it gives you, let's make this a little bit bigger. It gives you some sample code here. So let's replace our main component with this code right here. Let's replace app.js here. Save it. Let's go back here now. And so you'll see here that this code has generated something new in our app. Let's take a look at what it does. It has the about, it has the topics, and you can see that the URL is changing appropriately up here. Let's just take a look at this file right here. You'll see that React Router DOM, we're importing browser router, route, and link. And so this router is the wrapper around our entire component. And then the link directs us to specific URLs. So you have the to attribute here. So this clicking the home will direct us to the slash here. Clicking on about will direct us to /about, just like that. Clicking on topics will direct us to topics. And then the route here, it basically says that when we hit the slash route, we're going to load the component home. When we hit the about route, we're going to load the component about. When we hit the topics route, we're going to load the component topics. And then here we're defining the actual components. So we're basically doing everything in one file here. So the home, you just display home, about displays the about, and then topics displays this list of topics here. And then down here, we're basically exporting the basic example, which is the component up here.
Okay, so now we're going to build a simple CRUD app using what we've learned. We're not going to set up a server or a database or anything. We're going to keep it simple, so we're going to be using local storage. So we'll just be reading, saving, updating, and deleting our data from local storage. So to begin, let's start over by doing npx create react app, and let's just do react app. Wait for that to install. And then let's cd into the directory, and then do yarn start, and then we'll see it show up in the browser. And now let's open up our folder for React app. So the first thing we're going to do is initiate our database, or in our case, local storage, with some initial products. So let's do local storage.setItem products. And then let's actually define our initial products above. So let's create an array with some products. Let's say the first one has a name of iPad and a price of 200. And the second one has a name of iPhone with a price of 650. And then let's set products as the JSON stringified version of the array that we just created. Now let's delete this boilerplate code and just type in a title for our app. Let's say Products Manager. And now let's fetch or read our products from local storage. we're going to do this in component will mount. So let's create that method, and then in there, let's type local storage.getItem products. And then let's set that to a constant called products. And then let's console log that out to make sure we're getting it correctly, and we see that we are. But that's the JSON stringified version, so we'll need to do JSON parse to get it in the JavaScript version. And now we see that products is a proper JavaScript array. Now let's create our state that we're going to store this array in. And then, instead of reading and writing to local storage all the time, let's just interact with the state to make things simpler. Just know that whenever we interact with the state, we can also write code to store the new state into local storage, or whatever database you want to use. So let's create a constructor method, write super props, and then create our state object, where we'll just have one property called products, and it'll start as an empty array. Next, in our component will mount, after we get the products, let's use setState to set the products to the products we got from local storage. And then let's display our list of products by going to the render method, and then in single curly braces, we'll type this.state.products.map, then product, then an arrow for a function in ES6 syntax. And then for each product, we'll return a div with a key of product.name. And in this div, let's display spans that contain the product name and the product price. And then let's save to see if this displays correctly, and we see that it does. Next, let's create a separate method for getting our products, which we'll be using later on. So let's create a method called getProducts, and in here we'll just paste what we wrote in component did mount. And then in component will mount, let's put this.getProducts, and then save to make sure we didn't break anything. Now, let's write code to delete a product. First, let's break up what we have here into multiple lines to make it look cleaner. To get the pipes to keep their spaces, let's use asterisks in single curly braces, which are another ES6 feature. Asterisks make sure that spaces are preserved. Let's make a new section, and then let's create a delete button. Now, we're going to want to pass the name of the product we want to delete into our delete event handler. We could bind that name to the event handler in this file, but binding to methods in the render method isn't best practice, since that bound method would be recreated every time the state changes. So we're going to actually create a new component that has a self-contained state with a single product's name and price. So let's create a new file called productitem.js. And then let's copy over the code from the other file and just adjust it for our purposes. Let's delete the code up here. Delete the methods. And then let's copy over just the code for rendering the individual product. Let's replace the render here with that code. And let's rename the component product item. Let's delete the key in here, and then let's get the name and the price from the props. And then in app.js, let's import our product item component from // and let's actually rename our file using Pascal case. So productitem.js. and then import from product item. Next, let's replace the code down here with our product item component. And let's give this a key of product name. And then let's pass in the name and the price of the product. We could pass in the name and the price separately, like this, or we can use the ES6 spread operator, which will basically pass them in all at once by using 3 dots, like this. Let's save it. And we actually need to delete the products from our product item file since we're accessing the name and price directly from our props now. Save it, and now we see that everything displays correctly. Now let's create our onDelete method. It's going to take a name as a parameter. And let's just console out that name for now. Next, we want to pass this onDelete method into our product item component. And since we're eventually going to use this.setState in this method, we'll need to bind the context to this in the constructor first. So we'll write this.onDelete equals this.onDelete.bind this. Next, let's define the onDelete from the props. And then let's create a click handler for the delete button. Let's actually make it refer to an onDelete method in this file to avoid having to bind anything in the render method. So let's do onClick equals this.onDelete, and then let's bind this method in the constructor again. So let's do this.onDelete equals this.onDelete.bind this. Next, let's define the onDelete method, where we're just going to pass the name into the onDelete method that's being passed in as a prop from app.js. Let's do this.props.onDelete, and then pass in this.props.name. And we can actually use destructuring to make this look cleaner. So const onDelete name equals this.props, and then delete the this.props below. And now when we click on the delete button, we'll see that the name is logged to the console. Now let's define the onDelete method where the product will actually get deleted. First, let's clean up some code. We need the getProducts method to just return the list of products. So let's set the this.products in component will mount to be a variable. And let's move the this.setState up to component will mount. And then in getProducts, let's return the list of products. And then in onDelete, let's do products equals this.getProducts. And then let's do const filtered products equals products.filter. And then for each product, we only want the ones that don't match the name of the product we clicked to delete. And then let's console log that to make sure we're getting the array we expect. And it looks like we have an onDelete that we're not using. So let's first delete that. Okay, so now if we click on the delete button for a product, we can see that an array of just one product is correctly logged to the console. So then we want to set the state of products to the filtered products. And we actually want our getProducts to return the products from the state instead of from local storage, which we aren't actually updating in our app. So let's do a little bit of refactoring. Let's have our initial state in our constructor be directly from local storage. And then let's change our getProducts to get the products from this state. And now if we click on the delete buttons, the products will properly delete. Now let's write code to add a product to our list. Let's first create an onAdd method, and then let's create a new component for adding a product. Let's click new file, and then let's name this file additem.js. And then let's copy over the code from our other file to start us off. Let's delete everything we don't need. And then let's rename this component to add item, And then in app.js, let's import add item from /add item. And then let's add this component to the render method in app.js. And then in add item, let's create an input with the placeholder name. Let's give it a title of add product. And let's actually rename this file to be add product. And then change all of the names we just typed to be also add product. Then let's go back to our add product file. And let's add an HR tag to separate it from the list. And then let's add another input for the price. And let's change the placeholder to be price here. And then let's add a button that says add. And let's actually change the surrounding divs to be forms so we can submit this by pressing enter. Now, let's go back to app.js and pass the onAdd method as a prop into the add product component. And we'll also need to bind this method in the constructor. So let's do this .onAdd equals this .onAdd.bind this. And then for the onAdd method, we need the name and the price of the product we want to add. And let's just console log the name and the price here for now. Now let's go back to the add product component and let's add an onSubmit event handler to the form tag. That's going to be equal to this .onSubmit, which we will also bind in the constructor. So let's do this .onSubmit equals this .onSubmit.bind this. And then let's create the onSubmit method. It'll take an event. And we'll want to first do event.preventDefault to prevent the page from refreshing. And next, we want to get the value of the name and the price in the inputs. To do that, we'll add ref attributes to the inputs. So we'll do ref equals name input, and then this .name input equals name input. And then price input, and then this .price input equals price input. And then back to onSubmit, let's log out this .name.value and this .price.value just to make sure that we're getting these correctly. And let's type some things in our inputs, press enter, and we see that the name and the price are properly logged to the console. Now in onSubmit, let's call this .props.onSubmit with the name and the price. And then back in app.js, let's actually add the product to the state by first doing const products equals this .get products, and then let's do products.push, and then we'll add an object with the name and price of the product. And then we'll do this .setState products. So now, if we enter stuff into the inputs like this, and then press enter, the product will be added to the list. And we can also add another product, and that works too. But notice that the name and price stay in the inputs after we add the product. Let's clear those out when we add the product. So let's go to the add product file, and right at the end of this method, this .nameinput.value equals empty string, and this .priceinput.value equals empty string. So now, when we save our product, the input fields will clear out properly. Now we want to be able to edit our products. Let's start by adding an edit button right before the delete button. So let's add the button, and then let's add a pipe between the buttons, and let's change the text to be edit, and the onClick handler to be this .onEdit, and then let's bind this .onEdit in the constructor. And now let's add an isEditState property to the product item component. This property will tell us whether we are in edit mode or normal view mode. And let's default isEdit to false. And now let's create the onEdit method. Here we'll set isEdit to true. Then in the render method, if this.state.isEdit is true, then we will render the edit version. If it's not true, we'll just render what we currently have. In the isEdit version, let's just put an empty div there for now to see if it works. And we need a tag that surrounds this code in the non-edit part. And now, when we click on the edit button, the product will become an empty div. So now let's write the code for the edit part of this ternary. To do this, let's copy over the inputs and the button that we have in our add product file. And let's change the button text to be save. So now, when we click the edit button, the inputs and save button will show up. And let's actually turn this into a form so we can submit it with enter. And then let's create an onSubmit event handler that calls this onEditSubmit. Then let's bind this.onEditSubmit in the constructor. So this.onEditSubmit equals this.onEditSubmit.bind this. And then let's create the onEditSubmit method. Let's copy the onEdit method. Then let's do event.preventDefault. Then let's go back to app.js, and then let's create an onEditSubmit method there that will take a name and a price. And let's also bind this method in the constructor. So this.onEditSubmit equals this.onEditSubmit.bind this. And then let's pass this.onEditSubmit into the product item component. And then back in product item.js, in the onEditSubmit method, let's call this.props.onEditSubmit and pass in this.nameinput.value and this.priceinput.value. And then in app.js, let's console log the name and the value. And then let's click edit in the browser, enter things into the text boxes, press enter, and we see that the name and value are properly logged to the console. Next, let's set the default value of the text boxes by going back to product item.js and adding value attributes to the text boxes. So we'll have value equals name and value equals price. And now when we click edit, the name and price inputs will be defaulted to the product's name and price. But remember, if we use value, we also need to include an onChange event handler to make it a controlled input. So let's just keep our inputs uncontrolled. Let's change the value attributes to be default value. And now when we click edit, the warning in the console won't appear. Now let's write code to actually edit the product. Back in app.js, let's write const products equals this.getProducts, and then we'll do products equals products.map. And then for each product, we'll say that if the product name equals the name we pass in, then we'll set the product name and price to the new values in the inputs. So product.name equals name and product.price equals price. And then we'll save it with this.setState products. And since we're actually mutating the products variable, we need to change the const to a let. And since we're using map, we need to return the product at the end of the function. And then after we submit, we need to change back isEdit in product item to false. So let's write down here this.setState isEdit false. And we need to do something else too. In product item.js, we also need to pass in the original product name, since we're going to be using that
to find the product in the full list that we need to edit. Normally, we would use a unique ID for something like this, but we're just trying to keep things simple in this tutorial. So let's pass in this.props.name for our third argument. And back in app.js, let's add original name as a third parameter. And we'll say that if product.name equals the original name, then we'll update the product to the new name and price. And now, if we click edit and then change our inputs to new values, and then press enter, you'll see that the product in the list updates correctly. And let's just edit the other product too, just to make sure, and we see that that one updates correctly too.